The Polyglot Gathering is brought to you by italki. Become fluent in any language.
Okay, so people who have heard me present before, I'm a changed man. I have 43 slides, not 140. So my plan is that each slide will take less than 1 minute. So there should be time for questions. I'm not sure whether we should have questions during the presentation, though there might be some because, well, the subject, as you know here, is sounding like a native speaker, so I want to address the myth and reality. And let's go to the second one here. So here is the myth that native-like accent can only be developed during childhood. The only way to deal with this is to talk about biology, because the only possibility of an impossibility would have to be biological, neurological, developmental. So I'm going to talk about neurology. So there might be a lot of terms which you're not familiar with. So I tried to give some notes down at the bottom. So if there really is a question about understanding, okay, then we'll take it. But let's hold on, keep the discussion at the end. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so basically, when we look at the adult learner, L2 meaning second language or additional languages, we see that the brain using the type of instruments which allow you to look into the activities of the brain, which is a very dynamic place. Things are changing at any age. So there's a change in the brain's electrical activity and the location where it's taking place, and then the structure after the learning experience has taken place. There's a change in the structure of the brain, the neural network. This works, I guess, huh? Okay. So, maybe you've heard of the CPH, the critical period hypothesis. Everybody? Yeah. It's the idea that after a certain age that it's impossible to acquire a language to the level of a native speaker, native speaker-like. That subject itself can go on for hours. What is a native speaker, who's representative, on and on and on. But basically, the CPH is strongest when we talk about accent, okay? So I see the CPH as rationalization for non-success. Oh yeah, but I'm 55 years old, what do you expect, you know? Okay, so, first of all, the brain, there's a lot of neuroplasticity in the brain, malleability. That means it can change at any age. Now this hasn't been the belief all along. Actually, it wasn't until the 90s that people in the field started to realize this. And then some people, even in the field, haven't really caught on. Okay, so the brain changes over lifetime. That's part of the learning process. And it's particularly pronounced in the case of foreign languages. And as I said, the previous prevailing dogma, what everybody thought was that the adult, now what age is the adult? I mean, there's various definitions, let's say, beyond puberty, so 15, 16. Sometimes when we talk about CPH, people say 9 months old, 2 years old, 7 years old. It's pretty ridiculous. But essentially, there was this idea that the brain becomes hardwired and it doesn't change. So, actually, though, this neuroplasticity, the changes in the structure of the brain, how the neurons are wired together, it's a normal ongoing state from the moment that you form a brain in the womb until you die. Well, what happens after you die? I haven't experienced that yet. But your behavior will lead to changes in the brain, and changes in the brain also affect your behavior. Okay, so the chicken and the egg situation, in a sense. Okay, early in life, these changes, these neurological, the wiring of your brain, they result from passive exposure. You know, the baby is born and all this buzzing and everything is going around, nothing's comprehensible, and quickly very quickly changes are being made. And even at that time, though, attention and vigilance, it facilitates this change. So later in life, it becomes very important to pay attention to the stimuli, what's coming in, and the meaning of the stimuli. I have this. Okay, so the brain changes or restructures along the line of what it's focused on, what receives attention, and mindfulness. And often, what is rewarding? So what is rewarding? We're talking about emotions. We're talking about the limbic system in the body. So the simple act of scanning the periphery, paying attention to things, this is very natural when people are young. Watch little kids. Always watching everything. As we get older, just kind of focus on things like this. And we don't get as many changes in the structure of our brain. So in language learning, at the bottom as it says here, noticing is extremely important in the case of language learning. So the amount of attention paid to the input, in the case of language, what we're hearing, what we're reading, and the meaningfulness can account for significant differences in the amount of change that goes on in your brain. Oops. Huh? Was that it? No.
Huh? Fine.
Huh?
Yep.
Okay. No?
Number 9.
Oh, number 9.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You know, I speak in front of groups all the time. I'm a professor, I lecture, but I don't do it in English so often, so I'm a little bit nervous speaking English, so it's my mother tongue. I normally lecture in Japanese, so it feels more comfortable that way. Okay. So, neuroplasticity change occurs when the mind is in a state of attention and focus. So I'm going to talk about some experiments which show this. So they can be very reward dependent. So here's an experiment. The poor monkeys. Okay, 2 sets of monkeys. There's an auditory stimulation. They're listening to something on earphones. There's also a stimulation on the finger, something the monkey can touch and control. The monkey gets rewarded for reacting to changes in what the monkey's hearing in one set. I guess on the next slide. Yes. One group of monkeys, they both sets do the same thing, but one is rewarded for noticing changes in what the monkey's hearing, and the other one is rewarded for noticing changes in what they're feeling with the finger. Okay, so, got that?
Yeah.
All right, so now, did I jump one? Oh, where's the, okay. Huh? Oh, okay, so yeah, the conclusion is right there. Okay, so the monkeys that were the monkeys that were rewarded for noticing changes in what they're hearing had changes in their brain in that area which is being involved in that. And no changes to the finger. And the exact opposite for the ones that were rewarded for noticing changes in what they're feeling. You got it? So we can actually measure that. We can see the brain activity and what has changed after the activity. And you see he's smiling. So, okay, now as adults we can retune their brain to hear and produce sounds that are not important, that are important in target language but are not important in your mother tongue or languages that you speak. Okay, so, and this led to, in a conference here for in University of California, Los Angeles, on plasticity and speech perception, they concluded that the difficulties we have in learning languages later in life, they're not biological. Okay? So, the ultimate level of proficiency in your additional language, more than the age of acquisition, predicts whether how the language is represented in your brain matches that of how it's represented in a native speaker. So both native speakers, for example, both native speakers and non-native speakers of Chinese, they both develop the changes in the brain required that required for processing tonal languages. So those who do not speak tonal languages do not have the development in the area of the brain that's responsible for that. Okay, so another study, a study of a subset of late bilinguals managed to become extremely fluent in their second or additional language. And they demonstrated that the cortical, the representations in the brain, the changes in the brain of L1 and L2, they were indistinguishable from those of native speakers. So what it's saying here is it doesn't matter whether you learn the language from age 1, age 2, age 5, age 10, age 12, it's how well you can function in that language. That is what determines the way that the language is represented in your brain. So all these clearly dispute the idea that it's age is the factor. Age is just a correlation. Normally when people learn it at a young age, they reach a certain level, therefore they have that type of representation. But if you did it at age 46, you're going to have the same representation in your brain, the same type. Okay, so let's get into neural mapping. In order to understand the variations in accent, okay, so in any language there's many different accents, especially like with English you have regional within countries like the US, and then you have England, Australia, all over, and then you have international English. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to subsume, we need to group together certain sounds and say, oh, that represents an A or an L. Now, what's interesting about English here is that how many people who are here are native speakers of English in the sense that that's your first language? Okay. Now, so the rest are not. Now, if you can really pay close attention, American English has 26 vowel sounds. Okay, and British English, depending on dialect, is similar, so is Australian, etc. But the quality of those sounds are different, but we still differentiate. Most non-native speakers of English don't bother to imitate those. Okay, so maybe you just don't. You have to pay close attention to really see it, and then I could, give you examples. But the point is that we get used to mapping all these sounds to equate to the particular sound that is important for meaning. Okay, so what happens is the brain, not just for language, but for anything, the brain can form brain traps. So one example is if you sew a monkey's fingers together like this, then in their brain, the neural mapping, please understand that everything, your whole body is mapped in your brain, okay? And whenever you do something, or even think about doing something, you have the same thing going on in your brain, whether you're thinking about it or actually doing it. So, when you force a monkey to move two fingers at the same time, then later they won't be able to not move them at the same time until they train themselves to some training to be able to do that. That happens to violinists who are going, and if they practice on and on and on, sooner or later they can't move one finger without the other. Okay, so this is a famous example of Japanese R and L, right? So in Japanese, it doesn't matter whether the sound you're making is closer to, let's say, what in English is an R or what in English is an L. There's no difference in meaning. Since there's no difference in meaning, people don't pay attention to it. And in their brains, it becomes subsumed. It becomes like a brain trap. There's non-distinction. Every time you don't distinguish, it's just reinforced. Okay, so since the basis of the problem is the absence of differentiation between these sounds in your auditory cortex, the solution is that you have to create differentiation, and the easiest way to do that is through exaggerating the sounds. And then thereafter they become normalized in your brain and you don't have to think about, and they're distinguished. So, we talked about attention, so you have to pay close attention to the sounds, or your brain is not going to distinguish between them. And then maybe you don't hear it, so you have to get somebody to point it out to you, because you can't even hear the difference. This happens a lot if you like speaking, let's say that you speak European languages and then you try to learn Hindi, Thai, Nepali, etc., where you have ta, da, da. You have different, the T sounds, retroflex, etc. We don't distinguish between them. There's no difference between ta, da. So you have to train yourself to hear it and produce it. So the famous neurologist Mezzanich, he firmly believes that anybody can learn to retrain their brain through these type of exercises with this proper training. That the adult can speak a second language without a foreign accent. We all have an accent, okay? There's no such thing as, you speak without an accent. Well, that means you're not speaking at all then, okay? Okay, so, now what do I want to, so what determines whether you can, at some times, sound like a native speaker of a language which you've acquired later in life? Well, there are many factors. And last time we presented here, I started getting into it, and after about an hour and 30 minutes, people were going to lunch, and I said, let's go. Yeah, it's a very long story. So I'm only going to concentrate on what I think are the most important, which is identity and the emotions related to identity. Yeah, there's flexibility, motivation, empathy, on and on and on. Okay, so what I argue is that the apparent age-related differences are mainly a result of age-related differences in relation to the social, psychological, and affective factors. And affective meaning things related to emotion. Motivation is the affective factor. Okay, so number one, this is a big question. Do you know the song by the Who? Who are you? Da, da. No, you guys are too young. From the 60s and 70s, yes, Who Are You? Okay, I like this. It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always, all the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story. So how much time do you spend imagining what it's like to be another person? I do it all the time. I'm crazy about it. If I'm sitting at an airport, I watch people go by. Oh, what's it's like to be that lady at 60 years old? What's it like to be that young boy at 5? And then try to imagine it. What's it like to be very rich? What's it like to be very poor? I'm always doing this. Do other people do it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. I would think that good language learners do this. It's kind of come natural. So accent. The accent sends a very strong message about your linguistic and cultural identity. And there can be very strong emotions associated with belonging to the group, represented by the accent, especially if there is conflict amongst two groups with different accents and coming together. The emotions become stronger. So we reveal our affiliation with a specific culture through our accent. What group, various levels, whether it's national, regional, ethnic, social, educational, especially like in the UK, you have the educational and social classes very strong in terms of revealed in accents. So I'm saying that accent is a choice. It's a conscious or a subconscious choice. It's not forced upon you, it's a choice we make. Does that mean you can easily choose to immediately speak like in the accent you want to speak? No. But it's still a choice. Okay, so there's this thing called the community effect, where humans subconsciously mimic others. It's a natural tendency to imitate a person's speech inflections, physical expressions. People who get along well behave almost the same way, as they unintentionally mimic each other's body posture, gestures, speaking accents, and other behaviors. And I think, do people feel that in this group? Yeah, okay. Do you go to India and you start talking really quickly and then you, does that happen to you? When you go to India, even if you can't speak Hindi? Even if you can't speak Hindi, when you go to India for a while, you know, you just, okay. Does it start to come on you? I mean, somebody said to me the other day, because I've lived 36 years of my life in Japan, still live there, so last 36 years, so somebody said to me, oh, you just act, you know, people coming by and everything, I'm like, oh, that's nice. And, oh, you just acted Japanese. Oh yeah, I don't even think about it. So it's still, you know, I just came here 2 days ago. I still have jet lag. So, so there are 3 experiments about this. The first one is motor behavior, okay, movement of participants unintentionally match that of strangers with whom they worked on the task. So the experiment, you get people to work on something together, and you see that they start to sync in the way they, you know, expressions, body movements, etc. So experiment 2 had the Confederates, the people in the working together, mimic the posture and movements of participants and showed that this mimicry facilitates the smoothness of the interactions and increases liking amongst the interacting partners. So if you know about this, if you're conscious of it, and you want to get along with people even more, you can't exaggerate, obviously. You know, if somebody has a tick and you start doing it too, they're going to see it as an insult, okay? So it takes some, you know, social awareness here. Okay, so third experiment was that it showed that dispositionally emphatic individuals exhibit the comedian effect to a greater extent than do other people. So experiments generally demonstrate that observers have a tendency to imitate their interaction partner's posture and gestures more if they like him or her. Okay, so we can also, you can sit back and you can notice interaction between people and you, oh wow, they're really into each other, aren't they? You know, you can see. It depends, especially, let's say that somebody's been together a long time, you know, married for a long time, boyfriend, girlfriend, or boyfriend, girlfriend, girlfriend. It's all fine with me. Okay, I agree with everything she said. You see that, right? They're taking each other's gestures and way of reaction, etc. Okay. Now, I put in this, I'm kind of jumping around to various things. There's so much that could be said, but I'm jumping around to it. But it's all, hopefully you see, along one line of argument. I want to quote, does anybody know this author? Fantastic book. It's not about language, but it is about language. So a child does not acquire the skill of language by learning rules, but by imitation. A form of emphatic identification, usually with his or her parents, or at any rate with those members of the group who are perceived as more proficient. Imitation is an attempt to be like another person. And what it is like to be that person is something that can be experienced only from the inside. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's getting back to the brain, that we have cortical representations of our body. We start to imitate, etc. We start to create mapping, which is similar to what the other person's behavior is, if you're looking at it from a neurological perspective. Okay, so communication occurs because when we come to feel what it is like to be the person who is communicating with us, this explains why we pick up another person's speech habits or tics, even against our will. So empathy is associated with greater intuitive desire to imitate. That's why if you look at autism, the autism spectrum, you find that there's a resistance to imitate because some emotional issues there. And it's a long story, but there's a lot to be learned from studying autism and language development. Okay, so the emotional aspects, affiliation, are extremely strong in determining accents. So in today's modern world, you can imagine a child is exposed to many types of accents. Think about it. Let's just take America, for example, and New York City, and let's take an inner city African-American child who's going to see, watch many programs on TV, etc. All this exposure on the street and everything. But how are they're going to choose one way to represent themselves, right? Okay, so it's a choice, conscious or subconscious. So they can feel like you don't have a choice because emotions are so strong. When you break that, you can be an outsider to the group you're trying to be an insider with. Okay, so children acquire a particular style that is emotionally significant for them. Now, issues with feelings of legitimacy and authenticity. This also blocks us from imitating, mimicking. When I say mimicking and imitating, it's a very positive thing. It's just, don't confuse it with, some people think mimic, imitate, negative. No. Oh, I want to be original. There's no such thing as originality in a sense, okay? You don't have original. If you're so original in the way you speak a language, the other person is not going to understand you. So Beretta says that accent modification, maybe if you go online, you look at accent modification, thousands and thousands of sites and businesses, Especially like if you go to a culture, let's say you're going to the US and the job requires you to deal with the public, they want a certain type of accent. Or the call centers in the Philippines and in India, etc. They're taught to speak, okay, you'll be dealing with Australians. Now, and so they have an Australian come in there and teach them, good day, mate, okay, all right, I'm going to teach you guys how to speak Australian. And so all the Indian people there start talking like that too. And excuse me, my Australian accent's not that good. I have a hard time imitating accents in English because of identification issues. No, I really have a tough time. I mean, in my case, because I've lived outside the United States most of my life, 42 years. I just spent the first 18 years of my life there. And I have a hard time sounding like American at times, so. Where are you from? I'm from America. Originally, they say America. You don't sound like an American. Sorry. Because I change all the time. It's hard for me to control my accent in English more than any other language. Okay, so anyway, these kind of accent modification programs, etc. The research is based on ongoing survey. This is in the UK. Of students and staff from institutions and schools involving 98 people. Okay, so this is their conclusion. Many Brits consciously modify their accent in social situations as a means to create a better impression, but some feel that accent modification is synonymous with selling out and a clear threat to their sense of self. Do we have any Brits here? Yes. Okay. Oh, you're British, are you, Richard? Yes. Okay. While the most accepted practice, a third of the respondents say that they feel like a fraud when they consciously modify their accent. So self-evaluations of lacking authenticity and legitimacy can inhibit fluent native-like speech in a foreign language. You need to accept that you can become authentic and legitimate, become an authentic and legitimate speaker in the foreign languages of your choice. Okay, that's one big thing about making if you want to make the choice to sound like the native speaker. Essentially is being comfortable with having multiple social, cultural, and linguistic identities that are brought to the forefront when you're interacting in that situation where you want to use them. So the external perception of authenticity and legitimacy. So one is your own perception, and then the other is external, what you're getting from other people. Will always be subject to factors not completely under our control. So the degree of control you can assert on the formation of others' perceptions of you as an authentic and legitimate speaker stem from gaining pragmatic competence. In other words, when you start speaking the language to somebody, a stranger, if you can sound like a native speaker, the first part of what you're saying, then I guess probably everybody's experienced this. If the closer you get to it, the reaction you get to them, there'll be a different energy, there'll be a different perception, there'll be a different message coming back than if you sound very foreign-like in that language. And that starts the whole process. And depending on your degree to control your emotions and lead them, you can either go downhill or uphill in your ability to speak like a native speaker at that time. So when someone asks me, okay, in this language, can you speak like a native speaker? Oh yeah, I've done it before. Do it now. Well, that might be tough, you know. I mean, sometimes with English it's tough. When I've been away from English for a while, it's hard for me to just pop out and sound like an American. Come on, you need somebody to speak like an American. Oh, that's how you do it. Okay, now I remember. Now it comes out of me. You know, no, it's nothing to do with memory. It's just a feeling. Okay, identity. Oh, I got it again. Okay, so accent is an important part of that. So how am I doing on time? What do we have now? Wow, it's taking longer than I thought. Okay, so here is an experiment in Israel where the study concludes that the more empathy one has for the native speakers of the foreign language one is speaking, the lighter the accent will be. So the studies show that in addition to these personal, affective factors, emotional factors, language ego is influenced by the social political position of the speaker towards the majority group. Do I have the details here? Oh yes, I do. Okay, so there are three groups. They had 20 native Hebrew speakers, 20 Arabic speakers who learned Hebrew at the age 7 to 8 years old, 20 Russian immigrants who learned Hebrew after the age of 13. Level of accent and level of emphatic abilities was measured. The latter part with the questionnaire. Okay, the first part by Israelis judging whether that person sounded like an Israeli or not. So the accent level of the Russian immigrants and native Arabic speakers was similar. For the Russian immigrants, there's a direct link between the two measures. Okay, the higher ability to exhibit empathy for others, the weaker the accent in Hebrew. Amongst the Arabic speakers, however, there was no such link. Either positive or negative between empathy and the heaviness of the accent. So, like I said, why? Because identity issues. The conflict between Hebrew-speaking Israelis and Arabic-speaking Israelis. Okay? So, this case, they didn't want to be identified as a Hebrew, speak as mother tongue Hebrew, Jewish, and not as an Arab. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with this last concept here of self-identity and language ego permeability. This is this guy here, Griora. He does a really interesting experiments with hypnosis, volume. You know what? It's a depressant, and alcohol. You know, some people say, "Oh yeah, I drink a little, I speak much better." Well, there's proof to that to a certain extent. Okay. So what he stated was that second language learning, in all of its aspects, demands that the individual, to a certain extent, take on a new identity. So the degree of permeability of this language ego boundaries is found in the ability to achieve native-like pronunciation in a second language. So again, alcohol, hypnosis, volume, it treats anxiety disorders. That's why it's so effective. between, they looked at between the relationship between the permeability, language, ego boundaries, and pronunciation. So, okay, so the combined findings of the volume and alcohol studies are interpreted as supporting the theoretical connection between language ego boundaries and ego boundaries in general, and illustrate the extraordinary sensitivity to test the fluctuations in the state of the subject ego. What they did was, sure if I talk about it, for example, they do experiments where they use alcohol and ask people to pronounce things in Thai. Because Thai is not an easy language to speak, right? So with alcohol, they're much better in imitating. But only when they're imitating a human. If they're listening to a recording, no. Had a little bit of drink, there's a Thai person, yes. Okay? It's not just sound coming here. Autistic children can do better from a machine. So the tendency to develop a rigid identity as we mature can make adult learners more self-conscious than younger learners who may be more flexible in modifying and expanding their identity. You know, children play games all the time. They're pretending to be something in their games, and they're constantly looking at new identities, and they're constantly forming their identities. But as you get older, your identity becomes more rigid unless you become a polyglot and really go at it, and then you can take on a lot more identities, cultural and linguistic identities in particular. So the lack of ego permeability and rigid cultural identification, it becomes a stumbling block to learning another language, especially in phonology, or pronunciation, or accent, and fluency. So language ego permeability also refers to the ability to move back and forth between languages. So does everybody have different language personalities? You feel it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we know. Those who don't know because they don't have them, but they can't deny ours. Okay, so moving back and forth to this is this ego permeability. People who have highly permeable language ego do not feel that their identity associated with their native language is threatened by the acquisition and use of additional languages. Okay, so you can begin to talk. Now, this may be easy when there's big difference between the languages and cultural terms, proximity, etc. It becomes very difficult, like when I was a child growing up in Florida. Okay, so we had so many immigrants there, but the strongest the most was Cuban. Okay, so I'm only child in the family who bothered to. We all were taught Spanish from age 6, but learned to speak like a Cuban. I thought Cuban girls were really pretty, and you know. But when I spoke like a Cuban, then people look at me. You know, there's some conflict there. You know? So. Finally, what came before that? Yeah. Okay. So, subphonemic. So the
Suprasegmental.
Aspects of pronunciation, precisely because they are they're less important to be understood, okay? But these fine differences. Okay, that is where we see somebody's loyalty to a language group. Okay. This is so much better than last year when it was like, what, 140, you know? Okay, yeah, please. Is there another microphone?
No, it doesn't work.
I saw everybody else going to help her. I don't get to help her? Thanks. I don't know.
It's on the stand.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tim. If I explain that I just want to sound native in Mandarin, could I get a prescription to Valium from my doctor?
You don't want me to answer that, do you?
You asked that.
Oh, okay, yeah, thanks.
How we can become more sound more fluent and native speaker, and how can we improve our accent in many languages at the same time? If we hold a degree of C1, C2 in many languages, if we want to learn many foreign languages that have different accent, how we can improve it as to become like familiar with native speakers of this language, like Danish, Swedish, German, and French, and Polish, and Czech, for example.
All together. Yeah, you have to answer that question for yourself.
How we can improve our accents?
You have to answer that question for yourself. No, I don't sell techniques or anything. I struggle with it myself sometimes. Sometimes I'm very good at it, sometimes I'm not. No, seriously. I mean, if I said, okay, do this, you do that. You know, that's not it. It can happen. You know, how long does it take to? Let's say that you've been. Pick a language. Which language, for example, do you want to change? Huh? Danish. Okay, so let's say you've been speaking Danish for 4 years, but you still have this accent. You don't sound like a Dane, you know. So what do I have to do to change it? Well, okay, somebody will say to you, you go to one of these accent modification things, and they'll give you many exercises, etc., etc. And those are effective to a certain extent, but it's the emotions, the identification, and if you can't overcome that, it will never happen. So you have to understand yourself.
Yeah.
Where's my
Hello,
sorry.
hello, Tim Keeley. I remember I've talked once to you in Japanese through Skype. And I was impressed with your native accent in Japanese, even in Thai. Yes?
Yeah. Who are you?
I'm Marlon. From
Okay.
from Brazil, and I've been living in Poland.
Ale bardzo dobrze mówisz po polsku też, tak?
Też po polsku.
And
we talked even in Serbian. But my question is, it's about tonal language, like Thai. Do you think that when they speak fast, or even when you speak fast in those language, the tone differences is kind of blurred? That's the impression I have now. I'm learning, for example, Thai, and when they speak really fast, and even when I try to speak fast, it seems to me that people understand me better, even in Chinese.
But you asked me a question about mechanics.
Yes.
This is a question about the mind. And so, just like on the last question, I mean, there's not enough time for me to give you a good answer, because anything I pick, then you'll think that's important, right? So I prefer not to address that right now. Do you see what I'm saying? If I say, okay, no, it's important to do this. Oh yeah, no, that's it. He said that. He seems to do pretty good. You know, he's not stupid. I'll do that. You know, no, that's not the point. Yeah, go ahead.
Tim,
Yes.
thank you a lot. Two questions. First of all, do you think that pronunciation is more important than grammar when you learn a language, like sounding like a native? Can you fake your way for learning a language? That's the first thing. And then secondly, according to the facts that you mentioned, all of this stuff you can actually only achieve when you are in direct contact with native speakers.
Yeah, because you need the emotional.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So doesn't this kind of mislead the whole concept of classroom teaching? Like if you think of a group of people learning Chinese in say an English-speaking surrounding.
I don't do well in classrooms.
That's what I mean. I mean, isn't it maybe the wrong approach to learn a language, actually, especially when you.
So universities and high schools and such, we're going to say, okay, you sign up for German, now go out and learn it.
And then you would have maybe one native speaker teaching, and all the others have accents, and you just exchange, messages with people.
Yeah, but there's. I mean, you've asked a lot of questions. You made a lot of statements there.
Two questions.
Two there. But on the last one, I mean, I don't necessarily say having an accent is negative. I knew this French guy. I mean, he had the typical French accent in English, and he didn't want to change it. The girls loved it, and so the first question was about, if you're trying to sound like a native speaker, so Obviously, if you make some strange mistakes, it kind of throws, the perception off that you're a native speaker. And then, of course, it depends how long you're talking, right? Whether it's a short interaction or something. I mean, you could be walking by, and if you just had the prosody, like in Italian, you don't speak Italian, but come va, tutto bene? Va bene? No. The person's going to read that. He's like, tutto bene. Okay, so people just got to read. Anything, that's like the neural mapping, anything that triggers a representation of, like when, that's the way the human brain functions, or not even the human brain, all animals, is that it's very symbolic, so, that looks like something, so therefore I assume it is. Does that answer the question? Yeah, okay.
Okay, so, sorry. It's not entirely clear whether this applies to me per se, but definitely mild autism is somewhat probably more prevalent in this community than elsewhere, and I'm just curious, this presentation sounded like it primarily applies to neurotypicals, and I'm just curious whether there's other stuff you could say for people with mild Asperger's.
Autism is a spectrum, right? So we're all autistic to a certain extent. If you look at a spectrum, and autism is, it depends how you define that. I guess I shouldn't get into answering it from that standpoint. But last night we were talking about that, group 4 of us, and somebody in that group said that Esperanto has brought that person out. Okay, so I think becoming a polyglot is very good for dealing with relationship, emotional issues. I mean, not personal relationships, say all in general. Would you say so?
I guess that isn't really the question. You aren't really answering the question that I asked.
So what was your question?
The question was, the talk you gave is advice that's...
No, I'm not giving advice. Did I give advice?
No,
I mean, I kept saying, no, I'm not giving advice. No. Only trying to create a certain awareness, and if anything is of interest here, then you look into it further yourself.
Okay, I was just
to understand it. Yeah.
I was just curious whether you had information on how autistic people fare in the same situations, basically.
Well, yeah. I mean, I mentioned it because autistic subjects are studied all the time in terms of language. And so there's a definite association between the degree of autism when autism is thought about from an emotional aspect, and communication ability and language. Okay, for example, you have. Anybody know Steven Pinker? Yeah. Okay. Do you like his writings? I do. When the language instinct, he's trying to argue. He's trying to argue that language is an instinct, and so it's kind of like from the Chomsky, the UG grammar, universal grammar, that it's in your genes, etc., and on. Okay, so what he says is that it's not intelligence that's what's behind the ability to learn a language. All right, so he says, because it's in us, it's this instinct that we have. And so he says, okay, let's look at Williams syndrome's children. Williams syndromes are those children that they always want to hug you, and they're kind of running around, and they're very chatty, and they're talking a lot like this, and they're always very communicative, and they just want to hang on to you, and he talks about that. And so he says, look, these Williams syndromes usually have an IQ of 50 or 60. So you see? Well, I say, excuse me, Mr. Pinker, let's talk about autism. No? So you can see when you look into it that it's emotions. The emotional side of human relationship, when certain, but this, I don't want to really get into it because it's so complicated, as you know, right? But basically, I say one part of autism is that dealing with emotions, right? So being able to communicate and connect is difficult. Okay? So that affects language.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I like science, so I enjoyed your scientific approach. But I have two questions. According to my personal observations, even though you quoted some research is done about lack of proof to claim that the age influences pronunciation. I have a question. Why do so few non-native speakers sound like native speakers? And the second question is there any are there any proposals to avoid let's say having a thicker accent when you age? Because I noticed that some people get their accent becoming thicker over the age. If you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. But it's a poor understanding of statistics. You know, how to understand statistical data. You know, actually I want to do a presentation on this in the next conference. But if you look at that kind of data, you're not looking at the factors.
And why do so few non-native?
Well, we're talking about identity, and we're talking about how flexible children with their identity, right? As you get older, your identity forms. You become, more people become more set in their ways, unless they fight against it. Unless you learn, multiple languages and keep at it and keep working on it, etc. Then you get a more flexible identity. And then you have to ask yourself I don't want to talk about techniques because I struggle like everybody. If you want to sound more like a native speaker, we all struggle with it, right? Okay. So some people are more successful than others, and I'm more successful at certain times of the day or situation than I'm in other times. I mean, if you have the competence, okay, getting back to what you were talking about, grammar and pronunciation, etc. If you have the grammatical competence in the vocabulary, that's a given, then what you're dealing with is, your pronunciation, your prosody, etc. Okay? So once you get to deeply into pronunciation and prosody, you're getting into identity. That's what I'm saying. So just answer your question, think about identity, and think which language is easier for you to sound like a native speaker than it is for others, and why, and how do you feel about the language, how do you feel about the people who speak it, all those things to answer your own questions, right? You have to answer your own questions because it's you. I mean, I have a different, if you speak Polish, I speak Polish, maybe we have different relationship with Poland and Poles and our experience and how we wanted to sound like a Pole or didn't want to sound like a Pole, or would it be Chinese or Japanese or whatever, right? Are we okay with time? Do we want to go to lunch, or it's about that time?
So I just want to. Who else wants to ask something? 1, 2, 3. I mean, we should know there is lunch, but we have no talk after.
I don't mind. I don't mind staying if you want to ask questions. But yeah, I did good this time, right? If you were here last year, right? Yeah. 40 minutes. 41 minutes. 41 minutes.